Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Each one labelled.
There we are. We have everyone in the room, which is great. So welcome to another Tring Winery tasting.
Sit down.
Appreciate it. It's been a while. The last one we did was an in-house tasting of New Zealand wines. Wow, probably 3 months ago now. So it's nice to do another Tring Winery tasting, and for those of you who've done them before, it's nice to get back to the bottles of the whole rebottling that we've been doing here, which is very much something that that we were doing during the first lockdown. And I've appreciated now the efforts that the guys went through when they were rebottling into this tiny bottle, which is quite awkward, particularly when you're talking about some stickier liquids, such as sherry. But yeah, thanks so much, obviously, for joining us. And yeah, it should be hopefully an interesting night. Sherry for me is something that's such a wonderful sort of category. It's one of those things that I think we'll always talk about in the wine trade as a product that people don't. It's such great value, and people don't often get as much out of as we think they should. It's often seen as very much a Christmassy drink, hence we're doing a Christmas tasting. But it's obviously a product that can be had throughout the year, and in different parts of the world, will be drunk differently at different times of year as well. Just to quickly do a bit of housekeeping, we are recording this evening. There's a couple of people who unfortunately can't make the tasting, so we're recording it and going to sort of share a link. So if you're obviously uncomfortable with that aspect, then possibly maybe just sort of blanking the screen or something. But if you're all okay with that, I just wanted to obviously say that from the outset, just for general rules and regulations, essentially. So yeah, here we are, Tring Winery. I'm actually in the winery itself, so that's wonderful. It's direct from here. But so tonight we're very lucky to have Richard Witter with us, who's from Gonzalez-Byass company, who are just based around the corner from us in St Albans, really. And obviously they're sort of very historic company within sherry production. Sort of very famous company in that respect. So who better to talk us through things than Richard? So I can pass you over to him now, actually. And yeah, I just really hope you enjoy the evening. I hope that you managed to see on the cards about which ones to chill and which not to. But obviously, having said that, wine is very much however you want to sort of consume it, essentially. But there's sort of the guidelines with these styles of how best to appreciate them. But yeah, I'll pass you over to Richard.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. If at any point you can't hear me or the audio goes out or anything like that, just wave your hand or say so, and I can repeat anything that might have been missed. Unfortunately, unlike Chris, I'm not in the winery. I'm in my house at home, as everyone is and has been for the past few months. But yeah, so I work for Gonzalez-Byass. I've been working with them now for 7 years. I started off in the marketing department and was a brand manager for the sherries. And then now I work in sales and look after all sorts of lovely customers, Tring Winery being one of them. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a presentation which will hopefully help bring some of the things I'm talking about to life a little bit, and for some of the trickier concepts on how sherry is made and why it tastes the way it does, might make them a little easier to digest. So I'm going to share the screen now. Again, if anyone can't see it when I do it, then let me know. But hopefully you can all see this nice picture of some old bottles now in the bodega. So I'll start off with a little bit of history about Gonzalez-Byass. So there's our bodega in Jerez, where I wish I was. Unfortunately, This is always a funny picture. So we're not actually that great cathedral behind. It's just, if you take the picture from this angle, it looks like that cathedral is part of the bodega, but we're this building and lots of others. So it's an amazing place to visit. If you ever find yourself, when we're able to travel again in the south of Spain, I would highly recommend a visit to the bodega. It's a great tour and a lovely part of the world. So Gonzalez-Byass as a company was founded in 1835 by a bloke called Manuel Maria Gonzalez, and this is him here in statue form, just outside the winery. So this is between the winery and the cathedral, where his statue is on the street named after him, called Calle Manuel Maria Gonzalez. And he started the company in 1835. He was actually an accountant working in banks in Cadiz, and he was fed up of doing the books of all the sherry shippers and seeing how much money they were making, and decided he was in the wrong business. So he gave up banking to sell sherry, which shows how the world has changed in 200 years, or almost 200 years. I mean, he had no knowledge of how to make sherry, but his uncle did, and his uncle was called Jose de la Peña, and this is him with the nice mustache, very apt for Movember. So he had a few barrels, a few casks of his own private supply of sherry, and he also knew how to make sherry. So his uncle donated him his first casks, helped him make the wine, and basically started him on his way. In fact, we've just released this year a wine which was dedicated to Pope Leon XIII, which was bottled, or well, was put in cask in 1870 something. So that is probably the only wine we will ever sell in what would be called modern times that was actually made by Tia Pepe, Uncle Joe himself. So that's why the first wine you'll be drinking, Tia Pepe, is so called Tia Pepe, because it was named after his uncle, Uncle Jose, and Jose, a familiar term in Spanish, is Pepe. And so that's why Tia Pepe is so named. So yeah, that's quite fascinating. Unfortunately, it is quite expensive, this bottle, which we've got 30 bottles to sell in the UK of it, and it's what, 140 years old. So that's not on the tasting, but that's by the by. So we are still family owned. We're currently in the 5th and 6th generation of ownership. So our current chairman, Mauricio, is 5th generation, and the 6th generation head up our marketing departments and other areas of the company. And the 7th generation are out doing their thing, getting an education. Generally what happens is the family members won't slot straight into a job at GB. They'll go off and do something, and at some point they'll get the call and say, would you like to come back and work for the family? Which I guess is one of the reasons why they're still going and still family owned. Not many companies make it past 2 or 3 generations. So now we're going to talk about sherry. So I'm not sure what everyone's knowledge is about sherry in general. If anyone has any questions, please ask. You can do so in the chat, I think, or wave your hand or raise a hand, and Chris will be able to pick you out. But yeah, please do ask any questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And these tastings always go off down very interesting tangents when people blurt something out that they think might be a bit silly, and it always ends up being a really, really good question. So please do ask away. So in its simplest sense, sherry is a fortified wine produced in the Jerez region of southern Spain. So Andalusia, we have a map here. So we're down here, and there are 3 towns. So we're about an hour south of Seville. So if you're going there on holiday, fly to Seville, you can rent a car, it's only an hour away. And there are 3 towns here. So the towns of Jerez, San Luca de Barrameda, and Puerto de Santa Maria. Those are the 3 towns in which you can age sherry and bottle it and call it sherry. All of the grapes and the vineyards are in this sort of region here. So the green on the map are the current sherry vineyards, which are all on a special type of soil called albaritza, and that's signified by this kind of chalky coloured section, because albaritza is a chalk. So that's where it's from. It is a white wine that's been fortified by the addition of alcohol. If you've ever been to South Spain, you'll know it's very hot. 300 days of sunshine a year, mild winters, rains quite a lot actually. So this is in a funny unit, but that's 600 millimeters of rain a year. And the average rainfall for the southeast of England is about 450. So it's wetter than here. Just that doesn't fall as 300 days of drizzle. It falls as 50 days of heavy rain. So and the rest of the time it's sunny. So so all of that rainfall over winter soaks into these porous chalky soils, and that's how the vines can survive the long hot summers, because chalk is so porous. And because it's white, when it gets to summer, the sun's rays are reflected and you don't get as much evaporation, so the moisture is kind of locked into the soils. So we're going to start off talking about the first wine, Tia Pepe. So this is a good point if you have your first wine ready, if you have it in the glass. If you haven't already started giving it a sniff, then please do, and I will tell you how it's made and why it tastes the way it does. So the grape variety for all of the sherries apart from the last two is Palomino Fino. So that's this here. It is a white grape. We pick the grapes, press them, vinify a light white wine of about 11.5%. And this wine is classified at the point of pressing, actually. So you will have what we call the first yema or mosto yema, which is essentially the first press juice or the free run juice. If you've ever done any champagne tastings, they talk about la cuvée, which again is the free run juice, and that is the lightest, finest juice. So that goes off to become a Fino. And when it is classified as a Fino, we fortify it with neutral alcohol and neutral grape spirit up to 15.5% ABV. And something quite special happens when you are only at, well, when you're below 16 ABV, something quite special happens, which on the next slide I'll show you. So the casks we put the wine in aren't filled to the top. So you have an air gap. And on top of the wine, we get this layer of yeast that begins to grow. So it's called the flor. Flor just means flower in Spanish. Doesn't look much like a pretty flower, but that's more like mold, it is, but they call it flor, which sounds a lot nicer. So this layer of yeast, which grows on the surface of the wine and interacts with the wine, it consumes everything that would make this light white wine fruity and all of the body, all of the glycerin. So it consumes all the sugar. So you have almost no sugar in the finished wine in your glass. It's all been consumed by this yeast. So Tia Pepe is bone dry, less than 1 gram per litre. It consumes all the glycerol in the wine, and that's what gives a white wine its body, or any wine its body, also carries these fruity flavours. And a byproduct of it consuming all of this is it leaves behind a compound called acetaldehyde. And that is what gives Fino Sherry its distinctive tang. So when you taste it and you're swirling it around your mouth, you should get that really mouth-puckering, mouth-watering tang on the side of your mouth, and that is the acetaldehyde. So a Fino Sherry, the reason it tastes the way it does, the reason it's so tangy, almost mouth-puckering, very savoury, some people say saline, is the interaction of this yeast on the wine. So Tia Pepe spent 4 years in barrel, and throughout those 4 years, it's been aging through the Solera system. This yeast has been covering it. So when we take out a bottle and open it, that's the first time the air has got to the wine. So it's a 4-year-old wine that spent 4 years in oak barrels, but it's still light, pale, and fresh. And in terms of pairing with food, Fino Sherry is best paired with anything which is tricky to match with a white wine. So I always think of it like olives. I mean, Fino Sherry to me, describing the flavor of it to someone who hasn't tasted it is almost, I think of it like, how would you describe the taste of an olive to someone who'd never tried an olive? It's not fruity, it's quite savory, but it's tangy, it's fresh, but it's not, you know, an olive is very unique, and Fino Sherry is like that. So it pairs well with other distinctive flavors. Anything that's been marinated, those little anchovies, boccherones, the marinated anchovies, anything like that, the tanginess of the wine matches well, and there's no, it's got very low acidity, so there's no acid to clash with marinades like any vinaigrettes or anything like that.
And Richard, there's been a question come through just early on, just about almost this point really, in terms of how you drink sherry, whether you drink it as you would a port. I mean, I've sort of written back in the chat to say it's a bit more versatile with food than port. I mean, I don't know what your take would be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say it depends on the style of sherry. So when we go through these styles, you have, in terms of sherry, you have from the sweetest wines in the world. The last wine we try is one of the sweetest wines in the world. It is 350 grams of sugar per litre of liquid. So that is a dessert in itself. And then you also have Fino sherry, which is less than 0.5 gram of sugar per litre of liquid. So the driest wine in the world. And the variance of all these different styles gives it so many different occasions. So in terms of a Fino sherry like this, you'd serve it straight from the fridge, ice cold, in a if you can see my screen, in a normal white wine glass. I'm actually on the next wine because it's all I had open. So yeah, cold in a normal white wine glass, and a wine like this, a Fino sherry, you would have as an aperitif when you're cooking, while you're preparing food with nibbles, with olives. That tangy, mouth-watering nature of the wine really gets you ready to eat. It's a great aperitif. I'd say there's two great aperitifs in the world, and they are champagne and Fino sherry. But yeah, so that's how you would drink this, and the next style would be at the start of the meal or as an aperitif. And then as we go through to the sweeter styles, they suit more towards the end of a meal or just on their own, sat on the sofa.
And just a quick one, I don't know whether you're moving on to the next wine, but there's another question come in, so I hope you don't mind me sort of buffing in. But essentially, because we don't have a Manzanilla obviously on the tasting tonight, the question is sort of what's the difference between a Fino and a Manzanilla, because obviously they sort of do the same job to an extent, being both dry.
Yes, absolutely. So very good question. Where am I? Go back to this slide. So Fino and Manzanilla are made in exactly the same way. So they age what we call biologically. Biological aging is aging underneath this layer of yeast. So the effects on the wine and the changes in flavor of the wine are occurring because of this biological aging. So that is both Fino and Manzanilla, similar length of time, same grape variety, exactly the same method of production. The difference is Manzanilla comes from this town, San Luca de Barrameda, and Fino comes from Jerez. So you pick your Palomino grapes from the same vineyard, you classify them as a Fino or Manzanilla, and you age one in San Luca and you age one in Jerez, you've got a Manzanilla and a Fino. It's the same. The difference is San Luca is closer to the sea, and on the banks of the river Guadalquivir, which is this river here. So it's a little bit cooler. And the yeast, that layer of floor, prefers cooler conditions. So in summer, it's a few degrees cooler here. So you maintain a very thick layer of yeast. In Jerez, further inland, you can get 5 degrees warmer on average in summer, because you're further from the sea. So in the height of summer, this layer of yeast will be thin because it doesn't really like the hot, humid conditions. And so you can get a little bit of richer flavors developing from that extra heat and not as much protection from the air. So stylistically, Manzanilla tends to be lighter. Realistically though, there are more differences between different producers of Fino than between a wine made in exactly the same style as a Manzanilla and a Fino. I hope that makes sense. And then any other questions about Fino production before I move on to the next wine? And obviously, if anyone has any thoughts, if anyone's never had Fino before, and it's either, so it usually takes a few times to get your head around the flavors, but it is very unique, and hopefully those of you who've never tried it are thinking, this is really nice and refreshing and something to have with my nibbles. But it is
I think a point I would sort of make almost just in terms of how to taste these. I'm usually not bothered about putting different wines in the same glass, but possibly with these ones it's quite nice just because they are that much more they are quite rich and very sort of flavoursome and got that sort of texture to them as well. I'd often say with sherries and other fortifieds of sort of having different glasses as you go through, probably for these. Otherwise, I think it might impart flavors and things on the wine you're trying from the previous one, essentially. But
yeah, if you do have, I'd say if you've got 2 glasses, and if you can have 2 glasses per person, then that's good, because then you can try some of them side by side. So as we move on to the next wine, which is an Amontillado, I'll describe how this is made, and if you have a little bit of Fino and you can have the Amontillado next to it, you'll be able to really see how the difference in production has made the taste different. So Amontillado, where I'll go back to my slide where I was on. So Amontillado is just an aged Fino sherry. So go to this diagram. So this is where it gets technical. So notepads at the ready. But no, ask any questions if you want. It's relatively simple. So this is our system of aging sherry in Jerez. So it's called the Solera system, and Tia Pepe, here we are, we're bottling it here, is 4 years old. So the best way to think of it is the 4 years of barrels are stacked on top of each other. And we bottle from this row here, but we can't empty these barrels. So if we place an order for Tia Pepe, however much they decide to bottle, they will take a small amount from every single barrel that is 4 years old on this row. So that will leave a bit more of an air gap. And they top up what we took from this row with the 3-year-old barrels up here. So these top up the 4-year-old barrels, the 3-year-olds are topped up with some 2-year-old barrels, the 2-year-old barrels are topped up with some wine from the 1-year-old barrels, and into the 1-year-old barrels, we add some of the latest harvest, so the freshly fortified must. And what that does is it means that it's a non-vintage product because you're blending through years, but also it brings down nutrients. So when you add the new wine into the top barrel, it's brimming full of sugar and glycerin. And then as you draw it down, it brings those nutrients down. So it's keeping the layer of yeast on top of the wine alive, which means you keep this fresh, clear, pale Tia Pepe. When we get on to Viña Abbey, we just continue this system. So we bottle some Tia Pepe, that which doesn't get bottled will top up some 5-year-old barrels in the next Solera. And this Solera will be the Viña Abbey Solera or our Amontillado Solera. And that will top up the 5-year-olds, 5-year-olds will top up the 6-year-olds, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So Viña Abbey is 12 years old. So this has spent 12 years going through this system of criaderas and Soleras. Now, what happens after about 6 years is there's no more nutrients left. So if you imagine this fresh wine has been ever diluted, dragged down through this system, the nutrients are being consumed all the time by the floor. There's no sugar left, there's no glycerin left, there's nothing for the yeast to survive on. So it starts to die. So this layer of yeast will begin to die, it'll get thinner and thinner, patchier and patchier, and eventually it won't exist anymore. And you will have a barrel that looks like this. And the air is getting to the wine. So it starts to turn brown, like when you cut an apple in half and it turns brown, and you get flavors of nuttiness. And these are flavors from what we call oxidative aging. So aging effects from oxygen interacting with the wine. So the Amontillado that you have in your glass, the second wine, the reason it's a bit darker and browner is because the air has been interacting with the wine. So it should still have that tanginess because it's had floor, it has had all the sugar eaten, it's had all the glycerin eaten, so it's still bone dry, no sugar, still very light, still very tangy from the acetaldehyde, but you've now got some nutty flavors, some complexity from the wood, some maybe slight kind of spiciness from the wood is coming in, and the alcohol has increased. So in Jerez, unlike in whiskey, if you've ever done whiskey tours and heard about the angel share, in Jerez, our wine gets more alcoholic as you age it because it's so dry in the south of Spain that water evaporates more readily than the alcohol. Whereas in Scotland, where you hang your washing out and it'll still be dry in 2 weeks' time, the water doesn't go anywhere, whereas the alcohol does. So our wines get more alcoholic. So this has gone from 15% in Tia Pepe up to 16.5, I think, yes, 16.5%. And everything else is concentrated. Some of the flavors are concentrated. So again, in terms of how you'd serve this, it still chilled, nice big wine glass, and with food, because you've got some of these flavors from the wood, some nuttiness, pairs well with hard cheeses, manchego, nuts, lovely. You still have some seafood with this, or poultry, chicken, game is very good with these styles of sherry. So I think I've got a slide about Vignave. There we go. So that is Amontillado. So that is the in terms of the aging system, that's the meat of it, is this bringing down from young barrels to old barrels, running the scales as it's called, and drawing down the nutrients. So this is exactly the same liquid as the Tia Pepe, but it's just now 8 years older, and therefore it started to turn brown. The next wine in your pack, which is called Del Duque, is again the same starting product, so the same liquid. Started off as Tia Pepe, but now with 30 years of aging in the barrels through the Solera. So everything is concentrated even more. The alcohol is up at 21.5%. 30 years of aging means that the time when it was a Fino is a distant memory. So only 6 years of those 30 years was aging under the layer of floor. After that, it's all been oxidative. So the flavors here should remind you of a brandy almost. It's had 30 years in wood. The alcohol is high. The higher alcohol has extracted all these bitter components from the wood. So you've got candied peel, spice, lots of dark nut flavors like hazelnuts, and it's very intense on the palate. The residual sugar has crept up because we lost so much water, but still very, very dry on the palate. And this, so in terms of pairing with a wine like the Del Duque, I would say you're looking at hard cheeses. They need to be quite mature. You could have it with some red meats or very cured, so like hamon, a really well cured hamon, or almost in place of a brandy as a kind of a sipping, contemplating wine. So this is just, again, another Amontillado. This is just showing the effects of aging for such an extended period of time, 30 years in barrel.
But if I just jump in with a quick question here, Richard, and that is, I suppose, about the grape variety for these. Obviously, as you said, sort of wines 1 to 4 in this respect. Palomino Fino. Is there much difference in production of this grape variety in different areas of around Jerez and Sanlúcar and places like that? Because obviously, I guess with other fortifieds and other wines in general, you'd often talk about better vineyards for certain grape varieties and things, or is it sort of is that a big difference at all?
Yes and no. So previously, or in the when I say in the past, I'm talking kind of 30 years or more ago, when sherry was in its boom, or way beyond that, when the vineyard terroir or the vineyard practices weren't seen as important as the practices in the bodega and what we'd call the bodega terroir. So the conditions in the bodega when you're aging the wines. You did have, in very early days, sherry was written about, so we're talking kind of early 1900s. People classified the vineyards, so you had vineyards which were purely chalk and vineyards lower down where you get detritus coming down the rolling hills. So in the lowlands, the chalk isn't as pure because you've had all sorts of organic matter creating a thicker soil, and higher up the slopes you've got purer chalk. So there is some demarcation there. The reason it's a yes and no is that now, because there's not as much sherry being made, all of the remaining sherry vineyards are on pure Albarita, and the vineyards that have been grubbed up with a lower quality vineyards. So the quality of sherry in general is higher than it's ever been. We at Gonzalez-Byass, we own all our vineyards are owned. I think it's 800 hectares, which is probably the majority of vineyards in the area. And we have started now. In fact, it started about 10 years ago. My boss Martin decided that we should pay more attention in the vineyards as well as in the bodega. So we've gone back to traditional hand harvesting on the highest. So there's two pagos called Machanudo Alta and Carrascal Alta. So they're the highest regions, pure chalk. So now we've gone back to this traditional style of pruning, which is called barro y pulgar, so finger and thumb. So you grow the grapes from a long stick and trim the other one back into the thumb. And when you've harvested this side, you prune it back and it switches round, and the next year you're growing from this. But what that means is the vine starts to twist, so you can't harvest with machine. It's much more labor intensive, but it rests one half of the vine each year. So they get to be much older and you get better fruit. So we've now started doing that in some of the best vineyard plots. And we direct some of that juice into the casks, which then become our vintage sherries and things like that. But still, so, we still talk probably more about what happens in the winery, in the bodega than in the vineyard, purely because, especially when you're aging for such a long period of time, you don't need the most expressive grape. I mean, Palomino Fino is a relatively neutral grape variety. It's a good canvas for all of the effects of aging. Yes, hopefully that answers your question.
And I've got a question on the chat here about firstly why suggested sort of only slightly chilled for wine number 3, yes, as opposed to sort of obviously more chilled like number 1 and 2. And secondly, does the price sort of essentially of a sherry reflect that aging? So if it's had longer going through the system, therefore it's going to be more expensive.
Yes. So so the wine number 3, because it's so expressive, so long in oak, you don't need to have it. If you have it super chilled, so straight from the fridge, you're going to lose some of those notes. And I mean, I would almost treat wine number 3 in a similar way you would a very good brandy. So sometimes you might like to just put a single ice cube in, but if you get a really good brandy and you fill a glass of ice and pour it over, you're killing the flavor of it. So it's similar to that. You don't want it warm, because when wines with high alcohol, so anything above 18% or 18 and above, when they get warm, the alcohol starts to come off, starts to burn off. So when you bring your nose to the glass, you just get hit with the alcohol, and that numbs your senses as well. So you don't want them warm. So slightly chilled. I would say kind of cellar temperature for a wine like this is perfect, really. And then in terms of the price, yeah, I mean, so if you think about the level of evaporation we get in Jerez, so you lose about, I've forgotten what it is now, I think it's about 15% a year through evaporation. So the alcohol has gone from 15% Tia Pepe when it started, exactly the same liquid. The alcohol is now 21.5% just through concentration. And you're losing alcohol as well, just not as fast as the water. The sugar has gone from less than 0.5 gram per litre to 5 grams per litre just through concentration. So you're losing a load of product as you age it. Going back to that wine we released, which is 140 years old. So it was a full barrel, and we managed to scrape out 70 litres from the bottom. Like it's crazy how, and that was a 500 litre, well, 600 litre barrel, but filled 500 litres full. So yeah, it's you do, I think as well with sherry. So you think of something which has spent 30 years in barrel. It's amazing that they're still affordable. So I was clearing out my garage and I came across a wine list from a Glasgow wine merchants in an old bit of furniture that came with the house, and it had a price list with Chateau Latour and Tia Pepe. Tia Pepe was 27 shillings and Chateau Latour was 32 shillings. So not much difference,
Wow.
And now a bottle of Tia Pepe, you know, is 12 quid, and a bottle of Chateau Latour is about 500. So I wish they'd followed the same price trajectory.
But
And
and also on price as well, I'd probably say that this is where sherry is such a I was going to say affordable. That's a funny sort of term, but it's a very achievable product to purchase, because you're getting, I mean, certainly with your 30-year-old range, you're talking let's say £28 or so on the shelf in retail for a 30-year-old wine. As you say, it's gone through all that evaporation and concentration, yet it's still under £30, where you know, there's no other to read the region or appellation in the world where you'd get something of that complexity and that age for under £30. I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's once you get into it, and if you are into sherry, then it's a real bargain in terms of complexity for price. It's a real bargain. So we'll unless there's any other questions, I think this is probably a good point to move on to the next arm of sherry production. So I'm going to go back to, where's my slide gone? Here we are. So we're back here where we classify our newly made 11.5% reasonably neutral white wine, and it comes into the winery. So the first press went off to be Fino, which is marked on the casks in chalk with a line like that. And we do a second press, slightly harder press, and that becomes our Oloroso. So we classify that as an Oloroso. We fortify it to 18% ABV, again with neutral grape spirit. And when I say neutral grape spirit, I mean it's above 95% alcohol. So there is no flavor in it whatsoever. It is purely for alcohol. So it's ethanol from grapes, essentially. And then that is classified as an Oloroso, and that's a circle on the cask. The reason we use a second press for Oloroso is, actually, well, I'll go to the next slide. So at 18% alcohol, the yeast can't live. So from day one of being put in a cask, Oloroso will age like this. So we still have an air gap at the top, but there's no yeast present because it's too alcoholic. You can't survive. And from day one, you get oxygen interacting with the wine. So the reason we use the second press is because it's a richer style. It's not light and fresh like Fino, where the yeast has been protecting it from the oxygen, so we can have a richer must. We want a very light must for Fino, whereas we can have a richer must for the Oloroso. And the most important thing about this, so it will be nuttier, it will be darker, because it's had the oxygen interacting with it from day one. But more important than that in terms of flavor is it's not had the yeast. So there is still some residual sugar that was left in from the wine. So you have about 4 grams per litre of sugar, and you have glycerol. So glycerol is about half as sweet as sugar on the palate. So perceptively, when you taste this wine, especially coming from the previous wines, if you still have any of wine number 2, these are wine number 2 and wine number 4 are the same age, pretty much. So if you taste them side by side, the fourth wine, which is the Alfonso Oloroso, will be perceptibly a lot sweeter. I mean, it's still a dry wine. 4 grams per litre is about the same as a red wine you might buy. But because of that glycerol, it's got more body, more weight on the palate. You have some flavours of caramel in there. And it seems more unctuous, even though it's still a dry wine. And that is because it's not had the floor consuming everything. So Oloroso is a really good style of sherry to have with food. So a classic, in fact, I made it during lockdown 1, is pig's cheeks, carilleras. Pig's cheeks in Oloroso. So the recipe called for Oloroso, you braise them for hours, put lots of sherry in there. And I actually was planning on drinking a really nice red with it, but I cooked it. I had the bottle of Oloroso open, so I was like, oh, well, I'll have a glass of that. And it was just perfect. Kind of braised meat with sherry in the recipe is just lovely with this style of wine. It's rich enough, it can handle meaty flavors. You can even have it with steak if you deglaze the pan with a bit of sherry and pour it over, or it's just a really good wine for having with food. And if you like this and you're tasting it and you think, actually this is a style of sherry I've not had before and I really enjoy it, then it can be a great way of surprising people when you're cooking food and pairing a sherry with a main meal. I think a wine like this is perfect. Are people kind of picking up on the differences, especially between wine 2 and this, that difference in weight and body and perceptive sweetness? I'm going to pour myself a glass while I'm talking about it. There we are. So yeah, so that is Oloroso. So this has spent about 10 years aging. The next slide. 8 years, 8 to 10 years. And yeah, residual sugar is around 4 grams per litre, 18% alcohol. And it's 100% Palomino. So it is a white grape.
Do you find as well, Richard, that people are very sort of fixed on what style they like, or do people sort of play around, you think, with depending what they're eating? Because I feel personally I'm probably more of an Oloroso person, but you know that does change perhaps on occasion.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the split is dry or sweet, generally. And then Fino kind of sits slightly aside because of those unique tangy characters. I find that once especially if you've been out to Spain and you've sat on a beach and 40 degrees and you've had a plate of fried fish and Fino on tap, you kind of, that's it, it's done, you're sold. We always say if we had infinite marketing budget, we'd just fly everyone out to Jerez and then sherry sales would go through the roof. But it's that context of hot weather, ice cold Fino and some fish, and it's just perfect. But you need to kind of get it, and there's an occasion for it. So for me personally, at home, I will always have Fino in the house, but then I'll drink it when I've got olives, or I cannot have a boccherone, a marinated anchovy, without a glass of Fino. It's impossible. Even if it's supposed to be a dry day, if there's any of those around, I'm like, get the Fino out, I'm having a glass. So and then these styles, the darker styles, are less everyday for me. So it'd be more, I'm decided, usually if I'm cooking and the recipe calls for an Oloroso, I'll be like, yeah, you know what, I'm just going to have a few glasses of this with the dish. Yeah, so for me, I'm every day, well, not every day, but weekly or more, I'm probably having a glass of Fino. Whereas with Oloroso, it's more, I might plan a meal, especially if I'm cooking Spanish food or a nice stew or anything like that. I'll, like you would with lots of the wines in the shop where you are, like, people will come in and they say, I'm cooking X, what would you recommend? And there's certain wines which will go really well with certain cuisines. So that's kind of how I look at the likes of the Oloroso and things like that.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, they're really wonderful. I think that the whole concept of tasting them side by side like this as well is something that people don't often do. If you're in a bar, or even at home, you'll sort of go from one and then to another, as opposed to sitting with them side by side and really trying to tell the differences, because I think that's particularly with sherries, I think it's absolutely fascinating. They're so different to each other.
Yeah, and I mean it kind of, hopefully it makes sense, but as in how the wines are made, the fact that they're exactly the same grape variety, and the difference that the yeast, that layer of flour, has on the end product, and then the difference that age can have, it's quite clear. You can really see if you're going back to wine 2 and wine 4, they're both quite dark. They've both been oxidatively aged for 8 years. But that first 4 years of the Amontillado having flour has completely transformed the wine. So it's I find it fascinating. So hopefully other people do as well. So then the next wine we have is a cream. I think it's Matusalem, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
this is the first introduction to a different grape variety, and this is a sweet sherry. So this is a blend. So 75% of wine number 5 is Oloroso. So starts off as Alfonso. So 75% is of wine number 5 is wine number 4. It has been aged 30 years in wine number 5. And 25% is Pedro Jimenez. The blend is made at around 8 years. So we have a cream sherry that is about 8 years old as well, called Solera 1847. And we blend our Oloroso with our Pedro Jimenez at about 8 years. After a year of homogenizing, we then bottle our Solera 1847, which is our everyday cream sherry. And the rest ages for another 21 years and becomes Matusalem. So Pedro Jimenez, I'll talk about how it's made. It is another white grape. However, it's picked and left in the sun to dry for a minimum of 10 days, usually 2 weeks, depends how hot it is and which wind is blowing. And the grapes lose most of their water, well, it says on the slide, 40% of their water content. And the sugar concentration in the grapes is doubled. And then so I think it's, yeah, you've got here the pictures of the shriveled grapes. Got another slide showing them all. This is when they've just been picked, being laid on the mats, and they're just left there. It's called soleo, this process. And you pick the raisin grapes and we press them. It needs to be pressed with a mechanical press because it would gunge up a normal wine press. And you get a very thick liquid, which we ferment. But it ferments incredibly slowly. There's so much sugar, the yeasts are overwhelmed. So it ferments to about 3%. Very slowly, and then we fortify it with alcohol up to 15% alcohol. So the sugar is natural sugar from the raisin grapes in Pedro Jimenez. The blend with Oloroso makes it a cream. So everyone's heard of cream sherry because of the two big brands, Harvey's and Croft. One's a pale cream, one's a dark cream. The definition of cream sherry is that it is a sherry that has been sweetened. The commercial creams are sweetened with sugar, essentially, and proper creams are sweetened with the addition of Pedro Jimenez. So if you buy a bottle, then you can play a game of guess where it says cream on the bottle, because we've hidden it on the back in the smallest font we're legally allowed to do, because this is a 30-year-old sweet Oloroso, and the term cream has quite negative connotations. We used to call it Oloroso Dulce, which sounds a lot better, but we have to call it cream. So say the council in Jerez. But yeah, so this, I mean, you've got, in terms of flavors when you're tasting it, all those flavors from the raisin grapes, so prunes, raisins, dates, figs, all these sorts of flavors. You have some of the nuttiness from the Oloroso, the dry component, and because it's had 30 years in wood, you've got those spicy components from the time in wood. So candied peel, some spiciness, the slight bitterness from the wood, that kind of, it's often said like furniture polish, but it's more of an aroma than a taste. I don't go around tasting furniture polish, but you know what I mean? It's that kind of old wood flavor. And I think in cream sherries like this, like they just handle age so well. If you make cocktails, you're always blending the bitter elements with the sweet elements. So when you have a wine which is unctuously sweet with all these raisin and dry fruit characters, that extended time in wood just brings all these lovely bitter characteristics from the wood, and it's just such a lovely balance. In terms of drinking occasions for this, again, have it slightly chilled, and I mean, this is the easiest wine to pick food matches with. I mean, everyone when they taste it, they say, "Oh, it's liquid Christmas pudding," or "It's liquid mince pies." Like that's exactly what you could treat it like a port. You could have it with soft cheese or Stilton blue cheese. This time of year, I mean, a mince pie and a glass of Matusalem is about as perfect as it gets, or Christmas pud or anything like that. So this time of year, it's very easy to see how you'd make short work of a bottle of Matusalem.
Just a quick question about this sort of process of adding the Pedro Jimenez. Is it only essentially Oloroso that you would do that? Is there only a category for a cream that is Oloroso plus PX equals a cream?
Yeah, so it would only be with Oloroso. We do actually make another wine called Apóstoles, which is a Palo Cortado, which has had a little bit of Pedro Jimenez added to it.
Okay.
But you would only use Pedro Jimenez as a sweetening agent with an oxidized wine, because Pedro
Yes.
Jimenez is dark and rich. So a pale cream, which is a fino with sugar added, that's always done with sugar, because if you, I mean, you could imagine yourself mixing PX with fino would just defeat the point, which would be a bit weird.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would always be with an oxidized wine that you'd blend the Pedro Jimenez in with. Below a certain amount of sugar, it has to. The council in Jerez are really unimaginative. So below 100 grams per liter of sugar, it has to be called medium, and that is the official term for a sweet sherry that is below a certain amount, is medium. So you have to put medium on the label, which is just the worst term to use.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's sort of average.
Yeah, it's like nice. It's like having a wine that you have to put nice on. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
But anyway, they used to be called amorosos. So
Oh, okay.
lovely wines, because they just had that little touch of sweetness. They weren't as sweet as the likes of a cream. Amoroso, which is way better than medium. But
Yes, no, absolutely. And you touched on Palo Cortado a minute ago as well, and I've got a soft spot for Palo Cortado styles. Unfortunately, it didn't sort of make the lineup tonight, but a little bit more on that style, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. So where's my classification? This is a good slide. So Palo Cortados, different people will tell you different things. I've been to the winery and been told a very romantic version of what a Palo Cortado is when I know how they're made. But a Palo Cortado used to happen when you would have a wine that was free run juice, first press, classified as a fino, fortified to 15% alcohol. However, back when they were doing the fortifications in the kind of 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, it was generally done by jarras, so jars. So you would have your barrel of sherry, and to get it to 15% alcohol, you would add, 2 jars of high strength spirit. So you pour it in the top. If you want to make an Oloroso, you add 3 jars of high strength spirit, you pour it in the top. So errors would be made. And what would happen is the cellar hands would go around, they'd peek their torch or light in the top of the barrel and have a look to see how the floor is doing. And they'd find a barrel they thought was a fino that no longer had this layer of yeast on top. So the air was getting to it, so it's no longer a fino, and they would put a cross through the line marking it as a fino sherry. Palo Cortado, palo means stick, and cortar is the verb to cut. So it just means cut stick, because that's what the sign on a Palo Cortado would look like. So it used to be called the miracle in the bodega, and people romanticize how it's this amazing thing that happens. But now we have budgets, and we know how much Palo Cortado we need to make and how much we need to sell, and we can't make for someone to cock up in the bodega and not add too much alcohol to a barrel, or we can't wait for miracles. So so what happens now is you essentially take your fino classified must, so free run, fortified to 15.5%. Before it goes into barrel, it all sits in stainless steel, where it's waiting to go into that first layer of the Solera system. So while it's waiting to go into this top layer of barrels, it's sat in a stainless steel tank. So all we do for a Palo Cortado is take it from that stainless steel tank, fortify it to 18% alcohol, so re-fortify it to 18%, and then it goes into the Palo Cortado Solera. So it is essentially an Oloroso that is from the finest pressings, the lightest juice, which makes a very high quality Oloroso. So you could think of it as like a Grand Cru, Premier Cru Oloroso, because the juice which has gone into it is really, really fine, really high quality. So yes, so that's the unromantic but true version of Palicottado. And you'll find, so we make vintage sherries, and all of our vintage sherries are Palicottados, just because it's the lightest, best quality must. So if you're aging it in one barrel for 20 years, 30 years with no movement, you need it to be really high quality. So just by nature, it's a Palicottado rather than an Oloroso that's a vintage.
And you say when you make vintage sherries, is that different to other houses? I mean, is it something specific to you guys, or
I don't know anyone else that does, you know. It's not something, it's not like we didn't invent it. I just don't think anyone else does. There's probably an element of the fact that because we're family owned, you know, there's no shareholders demanding everything is sold or demanding we make more of the products that sell the most. Gonzalez-Byass takes a very long-term view on everything. And you know what families are like, they hoard. So we've got, I mean, these Pope bottles, so we've done 2 now. This one from Leon the 13th, and the last one we did was from Pope Pius the 10th, I think. And they're essentially, so we had a tradition, every time a Pope was poped, there is a word for it, but I don't know. Anytime a Pope was made Pope, we would gift them a barrel of sherry. But sometimes the Popes didn't take it, so it never got shipped. So it sat in the family cellars. So they're in the personal family cellars. And it's only because Martin, our boss, has been there and said, what's in this barrel? And they said, oh, it's just this 100-year-old Muscatel. He's like, can we sell it, please? But yeah, it's these, you know, that is the part of the joy of it still being family owned, is you've not had auditors go around and label every asset. There's barrels lying around that have been sat there for 120 years that someone's just forgotten about. So that's probably why we keep making these vintage sherries, because we like doing it, even though there's tiny amounts made and tiny amounts sold, but it's a nice thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anything that sort of increases sort of interest in the category as well is definitely a good thing. I'll just jump back up the questions if that's all right, Richard.
Yes, yeah.
Just before we sort of get onto wine number 6, I'll firstly state actually that the card we sent out today has wines 1 to 5. Normally we do sort of 5 wines as a tasting, but we thought that we couldn't have a sherry tasting without a Pedro Jimenez, so it's not the Pedro Jimenez in there as wine number 6, and it sort of speaks for itself as well, so it doesn't need much sort of information about it as we did for the other ones. But on that note, actually, on our card, we might have made a boo-boo because we said that the Alfonso Oloroso was essentially, we essentially couldn't find an age for it, but I think you said earlier that it was the same age as the Vina AB, so it's about 12 years or so.
Yeah, it's not quite 12 years. Once it gets to 12 years, you can put 12 years on the bottle. So it's around 10 years. It kind of about every 4 years we have to re-date our barrels, because depending on, usually they get older. If we're not selling enough because of the Solera system, we're not emptying the barrels every year, so they get older. So Vignette Abbé, when I joined the company, we thought that was 8 years old, and then we tested it and we found out it was actually 12 years old. So yeah, you always have to give about a 2-year variant. So it's around 10 years old.
Okay, that's perfect. That sort of makes up. Essentially, we marked it down as NV, as in non-vintage, which probably wasn't the term anyway to use. I guess it's more of a sort of winey term as opposed to a Solera system aged term. But essentially, we yeah. So there we go. Hope that's cleared up. And the other one is: are there any other countries sort of aping sort of sherry production, sort of making wines in this sort of style, essentially in this Solera systems?
Yeah, so they do it in Australia. So Australia did everything. You could get Australian port, Australian sherry. I don't know if it's still being done. I'm sure it is. In terms of the process, so there are other wine making regions in the world that utilize flor, so the species of yeast that lives on the surface of wine. So Tokai, some dry Tokais use flor, and there's a wine in France that I was told, and now I've forgotten, it might be around the Jura region, I don't know.
Okay.
My knowledge outside of sherry isn't as good as, as my sherry knowledge, but there are some winemaking regions where they utilize floor.
Maybe Van Joan, probably.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
It could be that. And then in terms of the Solera system, I think that is unique. There's a champagne house that does a little bit of Solera system. Forgotten the name, but they essentially, for their non-vintage, so a non-vintage champagne, you will blend in different vintages. So you'll have the fresh harvest, and then you'll add in some older vintages to increase complexity. But rather than doing that, so having 80% being current vintage and blending in 20% of old vintage, there's a champagne house that runs a Solera. So it's essentially the same. They're just constantly blending from young to old, and they will bottle for their second fermentation at 3 years or something like that, down their Solera. I can't remember the name of that. I was somewhere and someone was telling me about it and saying I needed to buy a bottle, but I didn't buy a bottle. Should have done.
Just stick to your sherry, stick to your Fino.
Yeah.
And then just one more here about how long would you say these would keep once opened?
Great
Because
question.
obviously, we had a recent, well, it was our sister company, the Online Wine Tasting Club, and we were talking about Madeira, and they're sort of essentially you can leave them open for as long as you like, but obviously the sherries will be different depending on presumably the different ages of them in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, a great question, and it's always good to clear it up. So the most important one is Fino. Treat that like a white wine. So as I was saying, the first time that liquid has seen oxygen is when you pull the cork from the bottle. So a Fino sherry will last a touch longer than a white wine just because of the alcohol. I mean, it's only 15%, so that is as alcoholic as some punchy red wines. But that extra 1 or 2% alcohol to a standard white wine will preserve it a little bit. But really, you don't want to keep it open any longer than a week. I would just treat it like a white wine for 4 days. Amontillado, it's had longer in wood, but it still has some delicate flavors. So with Amontillado, you're probably talking a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks would be fine, up to a month, slightly pushing it. With the Olorosos, so anything which has been oxidatively aged for either all of its life, or if it spent 30 years in a barrel, then a year with a cork having been pulled out the bottle and put back in isn't going to do anything. You think it's all about oxygen exchange, and you think of the surface area of the liquid exposed to oxygen and the fact that it's not constantly going in. Really, if it's been in a barrel for any longer than 10 years, then you're pretty fine. So yeah, I mean, all of these 30-year-olds are pretty bomb-proof. The PX as well, which we're going to taste next, there are some fruity flavors in there which will start to fade, but again, pretty bomb-proof. Yeah, so that's mainly it's mainly Fino, Amontillado. Don't leave them sat around for too long.
I was just going to ask something else actually, just again before we get to everyone sort of on tenterhooks to get to the Pedro Jimenez, but with regards to the fashion of sherry, I mean it's difficult enough getting the sort of younger drinkers in the UK to drink wine. I think there's definite stats about sort of 18 to 30s. Sort of dropping away in terms of being wine customers essentially. Are the things, and I suppose sherry is unfortunately seen as a sort of a Christmas drink. People often think of the creams, possibly the sort of branded creams, and it's often not seen in the best of lights, I suppose, in that respect. So firstly, where do you think the category is going, and secondly, is there much that can be done about that can re-engage maybe sort of younger drinkers with sherry?
Yeah, I mean, we've Gonzalez-Byass is probably the only, just because we are, I don't like saying we're the biggest because it sounds like some big corporate monster, but being the biggest sherry producer is not anywhere close to being a big wine producer. So we make of Tia Pepe, how many barrels are there? There's 30,000 barrels. So we probably make about a third as much Tia Pepe as all the first growths in Bordeaux. So it's not huge. And but because we are the biggest sherry producer, and we are the sherry producer that is still focused on innovating, we've been trying to do this for 10 years now, of finding a new audience, and it's working. So actually lockdown it's been unbelievable this year. Sherry sales are up a third, and that's not just the commercial styles. So everywhere they're up, which is, I'm wondering, we've been wondering why. We've all been scratching our heads, but we think it's because there isn't that need to finish the bottle straight away. So lots of people are in the house all the time, so they don't want to open a bottle and feel they have to finish it. So maybe they'll open a bottle of sherry, and over the course of the week, or the course of 3 days or 4 days, they'll just have a glass in the evening. But yeah, it's been quite interesting recently. But on a kind of longer term, we've been doing lots of marketing. We released the Enrama styles. We're constantly trying to innovate with, do lots with Spanish restaurants. We opened, so there's a sherry bar in King's Cross called Bar Pepito, which we kind of co-opened with Camino Group, which was the first sherry bar in London. Now I think there's now about 10 sherry bars in London. And we've got to a point now, it used to be even Spanish restaurants didn't have sherry. Now, every Spanish restaurant has a list of sherry, which is great. That is like absolute need to have. And I mean, by that, I mean quality style. So a Fino, an Amontillado, Oloroso, and a sweet, something like that. And now we're getting to where non-Spanish restaurants, like just fine dining, good gastro pubs, will have a Fino style as an aperitif, and maybe a sweet sherry as a dessert option. And that's a really sustainable place to be. And it's people experiencing it in good restaurants, having a good experience with it there, that will then decide to experiment at home and doing tastings like this. There's nothing worse than someone reading in the newspaper about how sherry is great value for money, up and coming, is a good thing to try, and then going to their local pub and there's a bottle of Tia Pepe on the top shelf that's been open for 4 years, and that's their first taste, because they'll never come back. That was your one chance, and they had a warm glass of Tia Pepe that had been open for a few months. So that's been the real challenge, is making sure that there's lots of places where people can have a proper glass of sherry served correctly with good food. And that's kind of happened. And now it's always been quite London centric. So it's trying to get that outside of the London bubble, which has happened. So we're finding the sherry market overall is declining slowly because of the big volume styles. The Croft and Harvey's make up the bulk of the market and are in decline. But the premium styles, so everything we tried today, is on the up. So they've been growing about 10% year on year. It's not filling the gap of the volume of cream, but we don't want it to. It'd be a much more sustainable place to be if people were drinking in total less, but of better quality sherry, and they're adding it into their repertoire of drinks. So people will have champagne for celebrating, different types of wine with different types of food, some sherries with different types of food, Fino as an aperitif, a dessert wine, they might think port, Tokaj, or sherry. Like, it's all building into this repertoire of amazing drinks, and that's kind of where we want to be. There's no drive to replace the, 500,000 Croft original drinkers and get them all to just be drinking one sherry all the time. It's it's about introducing them to different styles and adding those styles into a repertoire of drinks that an interested consumer wants to have.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I mean, obviously you mentioned the on Rama as well that you guys do, and also I think you mentioned earlier on sort of cocktails and things as well, sort of how
Mm.
how it can work with the cocktails, because certainly in places like Port, for example, that experience similar
Seasonality.
seasonality element to it. Obviously they talk about port, white port and tonic, and that's very much a drink that they would have in Lisbon and Porto and places, and that's what you'd have on a warm day. So I guess it's sort of trying to create something a bit different with it, that's sort of almost cross category. It's sort of getting people who are drinking, maybe obviously in that instance gin and tonic, or you might have people who are having, I suppose, things like espresso martinis. They might want to try something different that's got a bit of sherry and something else in it.
Yeah, we do a decent amount with sharing cocktails. It's kind of I look at that slightly separately. It's kind of it all helps with sales, but I don't know whether, and they are great cocktail ingredients because the flavors are so unique. So you can use like an Oloroso in place of a bitters. Talking of espresso martini, so don't use Kahlua because you've already got coffee in it, so you don't need a coffee liqueur, and use PX instead of Kahlua. So just it's PX espresso martini. So single shot of espresso, Pedro Jimenez, vodka, shake it. It's amazing. But the PX espresso martini aside, I find that a cocktail with sherry in won't necessarily make you try that sherry.
Sure.
You will be consuming sherry, but it doesn't taste the same. If you know what I mean. Like Angostura bitters, you would never have a glass of.
Yes.
But yeah, no, it's all good for awareness of the category, and people thinking about it. And if someone buys a bottle of Fino to use in a martini, as long as they put it in their fridge, at some point they're going to have a glass. We hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Another couple of things, one of which is essentially where the name sherry comes from.
Yes, yeah. So it's an anglicization or an anglicized version of the old Moorish word for Jerez. So Jerez, all the towns in Andalusia, a lot of them are called something de la Frontera. So Jerez, its full name is Jerez de la Frontera. You've got Arcos de la Frontera. So they were frontier towns on the when the Moors were coming from North Africa. So Sherry or Jerez was under Moorish control, and it was spelt Xerex, which was pronounced Sherish. X's are a sound in Moorish, apparently. So back in the day, so we're talking probably late 15, early 1600s, Sherish anglicized as sherry, and that's it. And so in Spain, if you ask for a glass of sherry, you just ask for a glass of Jerez. So a copa de Jerez is a glass of sherry in Spanish. So yeah, it just comes from the town of Jerez.
Okay, perfect. And also we've got a couple of sort of sherry diehards here as well. They've asked about Encontrado, whether that's a type of sherry or what Encontrado is.
Where am I?
And yeah, I was going to have to start sort of looking that up.
It's not a term I've heard. So of the other terms they kind of have. So yeah, there's Amoroso, which is that kind of slightly sweet, and then yeah, otherwise kind of just cream sweet. Pedro Jimenez. Yeah, I've never heard of Encontrado. Yeah, Encontrar is to know, as in if you know somebody, I think.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Okay, interesting. Well, we'll need to
testing my Spanish now as well.
Yeah, see, that's good. That's good. I like it. Yeah, no, that's. I think that's right. I'm sure that's and obviously Philip and Dan want to enlighten us further as to that name and what they've had before. That'd be interesting. But yeah, absolutely. So I suppose we've got the PX, the Pedro Jimenez, to try here. So fasten your seatbelts.
Yeah. So wine number 6. This is 100. This is nectar. So it's 100% Pedro Jimenez. So it's made from the Pedro Jimenez grapes, picked, dried out for 10 days, usually 2 weeks, pressed, fermented up to about 3%, fortified to 15, and then aged. So this is spent about, it's around about 10 years old, 10 years in barrel, but it's 100% Pedro Jimenez. So the residual sugar here is 350 grams of sugar per litre of liquid. So you'd need to, if you were dissolving that much sugar in water, you'd need to heat up the pan to get it to dissolve. So super, super sweet. Our winemaker, Antonio, always talks about Pedro Jimenez as being a dessert rather than a dessert wine. And I must admit, in Spain, they'll pour this over vanilla ice cream. I think that's the only real food match you can have with PX. It would just about go with sticky toffee pudding, or you could have it with chocolate maybe. But personally, I think you need a contrast for something which is this sweet and this intense and is so full of, raisins, dates, figs, molasses, all these sorts of flavors. You need a contrast. So a good vanilla ice cream, and the PX is your sauce. Whether you pour it on or not, you're having a little sip of PX and then some nice refreshing vanilla ice cream, and it's just lovely. I must say I tend to have Pedro Jimenez in place of a chocolate. So at the end of a meal, if you want something sweet and you might have a truffle or a little chocky, I think just a small glass of PX and sit on the sofa, that kind of does me quite nicely at the end of a meal. But yeah, so I mean, hopefully, PX is always one of those ones where it's if you've not got a sweet tooth, it can be a challenge because it's very sweet. But I think as well, as with all of the sweet wines of the world, it's supposed to be consumed at the end of a meal. So your palate has already taken all these flavors. In this sense, we've been through a tasting of different styles of sherry, so you're ready. You are ready for it. If you were to have it, 11 o'clock in the morning just after brushing your teeth, probably be a bit much. But at the end of a meal or after a nice tasting, it's a really good way to end. And talking of brushing your teeth, you'll still be tasting it until you brush your teeth this evening. It lasts forever on the palate. Quite astonishing wine. So it takes about 4 kilograms of grapes to make 1 bottle of Pedro Jimenez. So because of the reduction you got almost a 50% reduction in the grapes. So usually a kilo of grapes for a bottle of wine, usually there or thereabouts, depending on the level of pressing. So you got double that because of the dehydration of the grapes. But then when you're aging it for 10 years in barrel, you're losing all that liquid. So it's about 4 kilos of grapes go into a single bottle of PX, which makes it even more amazing value for money that it's £17, something like that for the bottle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those styles that certainly from certainly my early days of sort of wine education, you'd be thrown one of these and you think, wow, what on earth is that? There's certainly a few wines that do that, and possibly they're mainly sherries. Actually, I'd probably say a dry Fino and a Pedro Jimenez are wines that sort of stop you in your tracks, and you think, what is that? I need to know more about that. I don't understand it. And then from then hopefully becomes sort of working around the subject and trying different styles and trying different things, I suppose. But yeah, it's very much one of those ones that you can't mistake for anything else.
Yeah, if you're doing any wine qualifications, so have you done your diploma, Chris?
I have done my diploma, yes.
Yeah. So when you're doing the fortified exam, if you get PX, you're like, okay, easy. It's brown, it smells of raisins, like unless it's Rutherglen Muscat, it's kind of it's pretty easy. Like okay, PX. You don't even need to taste it; you just see it and smell it. Yeah, it is. It's an amazing thing, and kind of hopefully this tasting has kind of shown we've gone from the driest wine in the world to one of the sweetest, and it's all sherry. Which is one of the things I love about doing sherry tastings is you will never do, you can do if I was presenting a Spanish winery or something, it would all be wine and everyone's had wine. and everyone has tried red wine and white wine, and they've tried different grape varieties. Whereas quite often there'll be people that have never tried a sherry like this, or there's so many different styles and so many different production methods. So yeah, I find it fascinating, and hopefully you guys have found it interesting, and hopefully you've tried something new, or revisited some nice things that you hadn't tried for a while.
I'm just going to say as well, I mean, in terms of if people were to go on holiday to that part of Spain, are they able to visit Gonzalez-Byass? Is that a thing? They've got a room where you can go and try things?
Oh yeah, so it's huge. Well, it was pre-COVID. It's huge business. So how many visitors? I think it's 500,000 visitors a year we show around the bodega. And yeah, it's a great tour. So I've done the tourist tour once, and you even ride a little train, because the Gonzalez family installed the first train track in Jerez. So they have a little ride on train to take you from one bodega to another.
Excellent.
But it's great. So you're walking around. I'd liken it to. Has anyone been around Windsor Castle? So when you go around Windsor Castle, depending on what's going on, who's at the castle, whether they've got any state events, different rooms are blocked off. So the tour changes every time you do it. I used to live in Windsor, and you got free access if you lived in Windsor. So back when I was dating, that would be a good first date. I'd take them on a tour of the castle, and I knew the audio guide off by heart. But so it's almost like that. So you're touring the bodega in Spain. And depending on what's going on, whether they're doing some bottling, it just depends on which Soleras and which bodegas you go through, because there's so many rooms of barrels, and it's a really great tour, and we got lots of famous people to sign these barrels over the history. So Pablo Picasso's signed one, Ayrton Senna's signed one, which is my favorite. There's a room where all the barrels are dedicated to Spanish royalty when they visited and things like that. So it's it's a great tour, and you get tasting at the end of it. And I would say, if anyone, back when we are allowed to go and visit different parts of the world, if anyone is going and wants some recommendations on places to eat, places to drink, then speak to Chris, and he will ping me a note, and I will happily furnish you with some recommendations of good places to go and eat and drink in Jerez. It's great. It's a great place to go. I love it.
Well, that sounds amazing. I think you've done your bit for the tourist board there, which is great. So someone's asked about pricing as well, and that's always something we quite like to sort of come to at the end of tastings, as opposed to sort of having an idea of the pricing as you go along, in a sense. So for these, you'd be talking about £12 for the Tio Pepe. I think the Amontillado and so the AB and the Alfonso are sort of more like 17, 18. The 30-year-olds are 28, thereabouts, maybe 27.95. And I think the Pedro Jimenez is about 18 as well, actually. I mean, they are all on our website. So if obviously you wanted to have a look at that and buy some things for Christmas drinking, but I'm sort of doing it down there, aren't I? For any time drinking, then have a look there. And also we'll make Richard's sort of life much easier as well if we get a few sales there. But yeah, I mean we have them here, so come down and have a look at what we have on the shelves. I mean we are open anyway at the moment. Obviously it's been sort of much reduced in terms of people wanting to be out and about. But hopefully, well, certainly as of next Wednesday, hopefully people will be a bit more happy to do that. There are at the winery here, we do have great aspirations to offer more of a sort of wine bar element to it, in which case, sort of flights of sherry with certain foods and things could be something that we want to do here, but that's obviously been sort of kiboshed this year. But that's definitely part of it. And as I say, I think sherry would work really well like that. But we are still here. And talking about that as well, I mean, obviously you've got these little sort of mini glass bottles. There's no need to bring them back. I'm not going to sort of force people to return them. But if you want to, it would be great to see people here. We've all been a bit lonely at the shop of this last month, so it'd be wonderful for people to be back in the wine shop and the winery, because it's I mean for us, these things are great. It's great to be able to reach out to people and talk about things that hopefully are either different, like maybe styles of sherry, or things that you know but you just want to reacquaint and learn a little bit more. But really having people into the shop is the key thing for us, really. You know, we like that interaction. We like sort of learning what people enjoy, and hopefully pointing in the right direction. And we're very much keen on the aspect of, you know, we're wine drinkers ourselves, so there's some things that sometimes we might try and think, oh, that's actually not maybe as good as we'd hope. So we're always here if you have a wine from us that you think, oh, that wasn't really what I thought it was going to be like, and maybe it's a bit disappointing for whatever reason, then obviously we're here to help put that right for you. You know, that's very much our role as a sort of local independent wine merchant, really. It's all about sort of making assisting you sort of get to where you want to be, essentially, with your wine purchases and wine choices. And obviously this is a key time of year with the run up to Christmas, and hopefully there's that element where we can be a bit more sort of free to see people over the Christmas period. At least that's what they're talking about at the moment. Whether people still want to do that or not, who knows? But you know, sharing a glass of wine is one of sort of life's great pleasures. So hopefully people can get together. But yeah, I mean, the main thing I'd like to say tonight really is actually there's a couple of questions that come in, but is obviously to say thanks, Richard. I mean, that's fantastic. You know, just talking us through it so sort of clearly, and getting passionate about it, I think is really great. And obviously knowledge there, and obviously we tested you on your Spanish as well, which just proves that you work for a Spanish company, which is really important.
I was doing lots more lessons until my children came along, so I need to get back into it. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's been great. It's always slightly melancholy because I love doing these things face to face, but it's very nice to be in front of you all virtually and pontificate. So yeah, no, thanks for coming. It's been it's been great. It's been good fun.
You know, thanks again, Richard, and thanks again for everyone for joining us. You know, we sort of put this out there, hoping that there's that appetite to be doing something. I mean, this is actually before the lockdown was sort of called, but hopefully people had the appetite to be doing something that was unfortunately remote this year, and it's just been great to have you all here tonight, and also to be engaging with the questions and things like that. I think the last question is slightly different. So Sherry, it's all about whether the pizza van is back on a weekend, and it's Friday, Saturdays, from 5 o'clock, I believe. So yeah, they're the pizza nights, and hopefully come, when will it be, the weekend after next, I think. Hopefully we'll be sort of rocking again with a bit of a wine bar scenario, depending on what the regulations are. So it all sort of works well. So hopefully we're back to those pizza Fridays, pizza Saturdays, and they sent it to us as well, which is the main thing. But yeah, look, that's absolutely wonderful. Thanks again, Richard, and thanks again everyone else for joining us. And yeah, you know, hopefully see you down here at the winery. And you know, come and have a talk, come and have a glass at some point, and yeah, there you go. I think that's us. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone.
Take
See
care,
you later.
everyone. Have a lovely
Bye.
evening.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Take care. Safe trip home.